Professor Chomsky, what a pleasure to have you today. I'd like to talk to you about two things because you're an icon of free speech and of criticism of U.S. foreign policy. Both are very interesting to me. Let's talk about free speech. The left used to be associated with free speech. Does the left care about free speech now as much as they did in the 60s and 70s?
Well, the struggle for free speech in the 60s and the 70s was an effort to break through constraints against what could be articulated and what people could hear. Actually, the notion of freedom of speech is not so trivial. So take, say, the First Amendment of the Constitution. It doesn't really say very much, but the way it's been interpreted over the years, there are two dimensions to it. One is the freedom from government constraint. Notice that not freedom from corporate constraint, which is very severe, can give examples, but freedom from government constraint. The other dimension is the freedom to obtain information and to express oneself. Now that's different. And in fact, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, the article, I think it's Article 19, that's concerned with this, speaks of the freedom to impart and receive information. Now, if you go back to the early history of the United States, the founding fathers were concerned with both rights. So the state policies, things like postal rules and others, were designed to permit the freest possible imparting of information, expression of opinion, but also of receiving information.
Well, Professor, I want to go back to the thing you said at first, which was that in the 60s and 70s it was about breaking through, and especially about protesting the Vietnam War and other social change, civil rights movements for African Americans. But I want to follow up on that, because it seems to me that now that the 60s leftists have broken through, have taken over the dean's offices and the highest political offices, a 60s activist community organizer is now the president, or at least in the mold of a 60s activist. Is that why today's leftists are the enforcers of speech codes, whereas in the 60s they were protesting outside the dean's office? Now they're the ones with the politically correct speech codes because they got their way, so they don't need the tool of free speech anymore. It was just a temporary weapon to smash the conservative hegemony.
I don't think that's true at all. The constraints on breaking through to the public are probably greater than they were or at least comparable to what they were in the 60s.
So where are the leftist free speech activists today? Aren't they now the enforcers of political correctness on conservative ideas on gender or sexual orientation? Aren't there more speech codes being enforced by leftists now than ever before?
That's a dramatic exaggeration.
Okay, well, how big a problem is it?
Restrictions on freedom of expression and come from the corporate sector, the state sector, and they're pretty rigid. So nothing prevents me from saying in the United States that the Iraq War was the worst crime in the 21st century, but I can't publish. I can only reach very marginal audiences on what is a pretty obvious fact. You can say in the United States within the mainstream that the Iraq War was a strategic blunder, as Obama did, but try saying that it's a crime of aggression of the kind that led to the hanging of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. Try to write an op-ed about that.
But aren't you confusing things, Professor? Aren't you saying my power to force someone else to carry my views is my lack of that power to make ABC, CBS, NBC carry my views is a form of censorship? That's not censorship, that's their right to be free from your views. Whereas if you said certain things on campus about sexuality, about women or minorities, you wouldn't just face a lack of media that would carry your views, you would face student misconduct hearings, you would be expelled, you would be drummed out of institutions. I'm not talking about someone refusing to print your op-eds. I'm talking about someone proactively gagging you.
It is a very marginal phenomenon on campus, which barely exists, but there's a major phenomenon, and that is the virtual monopolization of the major media by private corporate entities.
But what about the internet? I mean, you're huge on the internet. You can go around them.
May I continue?
Please do, yes.
Radically restricts the opportunity for for expressing opinion and providing information. It's true that you can get around it in peripheral ways, but this is an enormous constraint on freedom of speech. I can give you, let me give an example of one of the cases that's not regarded, interestingly, as constraint on freedom of speech. I've published a number of books with colleague Edward Herman of Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. The first book we published was published by a small but profitable textbook publisher. It was called Counter-Revolutionary Violence. They published 20,000 copies of it. The advertisements for it reached one of the executives in the big conglomerate, Warner Communications, now part of Warner Brothers, that owned the publisher. He didn't like it. He ordered the publisher to not to distribute the book. When they refused, he put the entire publisher out of business, destroying all of their stock. Is that a constraint on freedom of speech? Yeah, but it's not considered that because it's not state censorship.
Well, Professor, I mean, you talked about 20,000 copies of a book. I predict our discussion here will have more than 20,000 views. I mean, I think you're disregarding the democratization of the internet that allows anyone with a blog or a YouTube page or even a Facebook page to talk to literally millions. Do you discount that?
No, of course I don't discount it. In fact, I've written about it, but it remains the case that overwhelmingly the media that reach the general public are under corporate control and highly restrictive.
Are you not a form of a celebrity? Are you not a star? If I thought of the top 10 academics in terms of their reach and the passionate following they have, despite this corporate embargo that you referred to, I would put it to you that you've been enormously successful. Your ideas have found great purchase. Aren't you a living disproof of your theory?
Not at all. In fact, it has nothing to do with me. It's quite general. I mentioned one example describing accurately the Iraq War, virtually impossible in the major sources of information in the United States. Same with the Vietnam War. I mean, you mentioned the Vietnam War before. Did the left win that? I mean, is it possible to point out in the major media, and if so, please tell me where, that under John F. Kennedy, the United States invaded South Vietnam, carried out a major act of aggression, which then expanded to the point where it destroyed virtually all of Indochina in the worst crime since the Second World War. Tell me where you've seen the phrase invasion of South Vietnam in the mainstream media.
I think that most movies about war, both in the Vietnam era and certainly in the Iraq era, I mean, there's American Sniper on the one hand, but I could name you 10 anti-war films. But can I shift gears, because you brought up foreign affairs, and I'd like to plumb your views on that. May I ask you about foreign affairs and your thoughts on the Obama administration? There's a man, I would say, of the left, not just a liberal, but of the left. Do you generally approve or disapprove of Obama's foreign affairs conduct?